From the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, consider this with Cathy Wyatt, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
And I also have a message tonight for the incredible people of Greenland. We strongly support your right to determine your own future. And if you choose, we welcome you into the United States of America. We need Greenland for national security and even international security, and we're working with everybody involved to try and get it. But we need it really for international world security, and I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cathy Wyatt. Welcome to the 29th season and this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, why Greenland? Joining us to talk more about it are UNO's Jody Neathery-Castro, Professor of Political Science, and Lana, Obradovic, Associate Professor of Political Science. Thank you both so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
All right, Jody, I want to start with you. Okay. Simple. Who owns Greenland?
Good question. Well, Greenland has a certain degree of sovereignty, but it is territory of Denmark. And so this is why you hear the different discussions that the president mentioned.
Okay, as we put up a map, I want you to talk with us about why Denmark and not Canada.
Sure. I think that's a long story going back to really colonial history. But the short answer is that Denmark annexed Greenland in 1721 and colonized it in 1814. And Canada was not a world power at this time, so in terms of being kind of major power players, it wouldn't have been part of that discussion. I know geographically, when you show the image like this, it really does suggest, wow, Canada's right there.
Okay. Lana, we have obviously discussed, right, obtaining Greenland through Denmark since the 19th century. Briefly tell us why that hasn't happened.
Well, as the president said, we've had this interest in Greenland for many years now. Since 1860s, actually goes back to the time when we acquired Alaska. And so 1967, and so the thought immediately was, how do we acquire Greenland as well? And this conversation about who it belongs to complicated that potential purchase. And so what we find is that Denmark back in 1860s was already telling us this place is not for sale. And we see that same conversation today, but that conversation today is even further complicated by the fact that although Denmark politically controls Greenland, Greenland has had a certain degree of self-rule, or Greenlanders have had a certain degree of self-rule since 1979. And so while Denmark is still responsible for their foreign and defense policy, Greenlanders think about everything else. They have their own parliament, they have their own referendum, so educational policy, economic development, taxes, things like that are all part of their decision making. And so it's really a complicated discussion because although we might be trying to purchase it from Denmark or get it from Denmark, the last word is actually in the hands of the Greenlanders themselves.
Okay. Jody, when did President Trump first express an interest in Greenland?
Sure. He was talking about it really starting in his first term. And I think kind of in the style that the president has, thinks of these as acquisitions, as maybe even real estate deals. And we really haven't had that kind of, as Lana mentioned, the discussion between great powers about sort of taking on smaller powers. It's fallen out of favor or fallen out of style really since that colonial era. So I think that was one of the things that made it so jarring, in addition to some of the alliances that we'll talk about.
Okay, we will talk about the why in just a few minutes, but I first want to get to this largest island in the world, right?
Correct.
And start with geography. So Lana, take it away on that.
Well, in terms of the geographic location, that is precisely what makes it really special. And Greenland, you know, it's no joke. It is special on so many different levels. I mean, and the president's interest in this region really reflects a broader shift among the great powers, how they're thinking about the Arctic in general, and Greenland, of course, as part of the region. And so it is no longer considered a remote region, sort of this barren land covered by ice, but rather it's the hub, a potential hub for political, military, and economic activities. And then you add the whole environmental layer to all of that. And so it is special in the sense that it's the largest island, which responds to roughly 3 times the size of Texas. And the vast interior ice sheet is in places more than 3 kilometers thick. So we are to a certain extent talking about these large expanses that we can't really wrap our head around just how big this place is, but how sparsely populated it also is. And I can come back to talking about that population in a little bit. But 80% of its surface is covered by ice. And so when we're talking about the geography, it sits on the shortest route between North America and Russia, which becomes critical for military positioning. It becomes critical for our strategic deterrence. And here in Omaha, in Bellevue, we do deterrence, nuclear deterrence. And so this is a very important part of that conversation. But it also sits as a gateway to the Arctic Ocean. As ice melts, these new shipping routes, the northern shipping routes, are opening, the northern sea route. And that is a potentially much faster route than going through Suez. So if we're trying to do business, this location becomes very special again because it reduces the travel by almost 40% if you're going up the northern sea route versus going through Suez Canal if you're coming from Asia and trying to connect to Europe or even North America. And so Greenland is not just geographically large, but it is a strategically positioned island at the center of these emerging global economic and military routes. And so its location really makes it a natural platform for a number of different satellites, radar tracking, early warning systems. And therefore, when the president said this is important for national security, but also international, it makes perfect sense.
How does climate change play into this whole discussion of geography?
I mean, as I mentioned, climate does play a role because this is the place covered in ice, and this ice is rapidly melting. And so what we're seeing is that warming in the Arctic is actually occurring at roughly twice the global rate, so it's melting a lot more up there, and the record surface temperatures are we can see them every day. You can just go on AccuWeather and see what the temperature is and see how these are not normal temperatures in this part of the world. And so the Greenland ice sheet is now responsible for about 20% of all current global sea level rise. And these projections are continuing to suggest that we're going to see a few more inches by 2010. And God forbid, should the entire sheet melt, that we're talking about something like up to 22 to 23 feet of water rising. But this transformation is obviously reshaping this geopolitical conversation because it's opening these new sea routes, and not just sea routes for military ships, but also tourism, also for fishing and search and rescue operations. All of these are creating new operational realities in the Arctic. And so melted ice is not only exposing new shipping routes, is exposing new resources, rare metals and minerals, and oil and gas, which this region has a lot of. So there's a whole a set of, that's why I said earlier, there's political, economic, and military, but there's that environmental climate layer that kind of goes through all of those dimensions.
Let's take a few minutes to talk about the people who live there. We're going to put up a few photographs for our viewers, and as we're doing that, Lana, tell us, after doing a great job of explaining and setting the stage for us here, who is living there?
Well, not many people. We have a population roughly just under 57,000, and the majority are Inuit, which are the indigenous Arctic people with a very long history and deep cultural connection to this land. And so they're often referred to as the Kalalit in Greenlandic, and their ancestors have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, so basically adapting to sea ice hunting, fishing, small coastal settlements. And their society is modern, but it's still very much rooted in the traditional practices like fishing and hunting. There is a Danish minority, which, for obvious reasons, many of them who work in the government and provide governmental services. There are also other residents from a sort of broader kingdom of Denmark who have moved to Greenland, and they speak Greenlandic, Danish, and often English. And as I've said, the majorities of people, because they are they have this very deep connection to this land, and they have a very deep desire to potentially become an independent country. And so for them, the conversation has been how to gain more independence from Denmark. And now we have another power coming in and saying, well, we would like you to join us. And so it further complicates the entire conversation that is not only about all the resources and political importance, but also about the cultural and identity questions of the people, of the majority of people who live there.
Jody, what is the biggest draw for President Trump on all of this?
Yeah, I think Lana summarized this really well, but if we think of it as a strategic acquisition in all the, sort of all the layers that means. Economically, there's opportunities for developing. I mean, right now, I think that the extraction is hard and expensive, but times change and needs change, and so I think that there's the opportunity for natural resources, mineral resources. In terms of the strategic location, I mean, I think your map did a really good job of showcasing just how, if you start to look at transport routes and strategic protection routes, you see quickly that the Arctic is very central in strategic location. Early warning systems, I think that Lana mentioned, of potential Russia attacks would be placed there, and so ramping up our security apparatus. We had more bases there, the United States did, during the Cold War. We drew those bases down, so there's not really anyone preventing, and in fact we still have the same agreements with Denmark that would allow us to ramp those up. So in terms of maintaining its importance for security strategic reasons, it's definitely possible.
Okay, to put a visual to this, we do have a few more photographs that we want to put up. You were talking about ice and so many other things. Let's put the first one up. When you ladies look at this, what's important for our viewers to know big picture here?
Well, you see melting, you see water and you see ice, but that's navigable now in ways that it hasn't been historically. And I think that, once you recognize that fact, I think maybe for a lot of viewers, they may not have thought about the Arctic as a navigable area. But you can see from this that this part definitely is navigable. And we're not talking about, the need for specialized icebreakers to get through there. As the climate change occurs, that becomes easier and easier, and obviously very strategic.
Okay, here we go.
I think if I can just add to that, I mean, I think you also see the rich and colorful and beautiful culture of the Inuit people who live there, and they have like I said, distinctive language, distinctive art. You had some of those pictures earlier. the traditions that are really rooted in the sort of sea ice travel hunting, and this notion that they live very close to their environment and they try to understand their environment and preserve that environment. It also shows those colossal ice sheets and glaciers and fjords that are central to that discussion of global sea levels. And just to kind of highlight when you live in a place that is so remote from, as you pointed out earlier, Denmark itself, it's really far from it. There is a very powerful sense of independence. And it's only recently, really, since 2009, that even Denmark itself has recognized Greenlanders as sovereign people. And when you recognize somebody as sovereign people, that carries a whole lot of weight in international law. And the United Nations Charter comes into place. And so there's certain rights and responsibilities that come with that label, and Greenlanders have embraced that fully, and so have always tried to really exercise as much as independence as possible.
So Jody, why then, having heard all of this, why isn't the way things are now enough for someone like President Trump?
Right. Well, I think that part of this is kind of that story of independence and the waves of independence that happened after sort of the world was carved into these colonial powers. Lana aptly mentioned the sovereignty that Greenlanders feel, and they have they have an arrangement right now with Denmark, and I think that. Part of it, frankly, I think, is that the way of thinking about this as a place that we can work with as an ally, maybe not front of mind for the president when he's talking about this. I think he mentioned in his clip, we want to have the control, and I think that is maybe part of his kind of thinking on these matters, but. There's a lot to consider with regard to sort of our allies and our alliances, and I think that's where really a lot of the alarm has come in trying to unpack this rhetoric.
Well, and up until recently, he was threatening force, which could obviously threaten international order. Tell us how, Jody.
Sure. Well, frankly, we have a military alliance with NATO. And Denmark, is part of our NATO alliance. In fact, one of the original signatories to this alliance. That is a security guarantee for the United States and for the rest of the allies in this arrangement, and it has served our interests really well. And so, it's a pledge of mutual consent and mutual aid for the members in this organization. And there's a requirement, in fact, that if, and it's called Article 5 in the NATO agreement, that if one of the countries is attacked, the others will come to its assistance. So it really upends that when you start talking about taking or using force against another ally in that organization, which the United States and Denmark are.
Okay, some have said that regardless of what happens moving forward, that the damage with NATO has been done. And I'm curious, what do you think from your perspective and from what you know, how would you respond to that?
Sure. I think there's a lot of alarm, and rightfully so, kind of given the rhetoric. It seems to have been walked back a bit, and so that's a good thing, because I do, and I think I mentioned that this alliance has really served U.S. interests well. I think that hopefully that kind of cooler heads prevail on this, because a lot of what I think the United States might have in terms of strategic interests can be achieved through this alliance by dialing down maybe some of the rhetoric on this. But yeah, there is a question now among our allies as to whether the United States actually would come to its assistance, or whether we're willing to undermine our own alliances for kind of national interest. And I think that's where the hope is that gets dialed back. I will say that our allies in NATO are taking some action in response to this. Europeans are starting to say, do we need to be thinking more of a collective defense pact that includes us and not the United States, something outside of NATO? We've spent a lot of time and effort and strategic activity in making sure that we have interoperability with our NATO allies, and there's a lot of benefits to that alliance in terms of just making the world safer and being able to kind of mobilize and deter, even as my colleague mentioned, deter the kinds of malignant and malevolent threats that other countries might want to put forward because they recognize the strength of the NATO military alliance.
Okay, Lana, what's next? I mean, what are you expecting? I know the two of you have talked quite a bit about this. We don't need to go into a lot of detail of your discussions, but I would imagine that what next question has come up. What do you think is going to happen here?
I mean, Greenland is central to NATO's Arctic posture. We have to accept that. And there are going to be some political scars following this discussion that the president has had with NATO and Denmark in particular. But I think the cool heads will prevail because they all understand just how important this part of the world is for all of them. And if we understand what our adversaries' intentions are in the region, for example, China has tried to promise some industrial developments to the Inuit, to the Greenlanders. Greenlanders understand that their land is rich in resources, but they need investments. And so they understand that they need outsiders to help them. Who that outsider is going to be is the key. So China has made its own bids, let's call them, but those bids have been rejected because Greenlanders have worked with Danes and NATO to kind of reprioritize and understand where their allegiances really are. And so this is where the United States and NATO come in. We already have a base, Pituffik base that is already there. We do already have some early warning systems over there. That part of the world, or what we call the GI-UK route, which is the Greenland, Iceland, UK. So those are very important routes, have been important during the Cold War for NATO, because that's the way that Russian submarines would get into the Atlantic Ocean. And so those waters are important. We all can agree on that. And I think if we double down on diplomacy, I think in terms of what's next, the conversation is going to have to be about how do we create a system that we can help Greenlanders prosper, and how do we make sure that the American investments are perhaps made and NATO countries invest in that part of the world and not those that could potentially threaten national security, international security in that part of the world.
I was going to say, Jody, so how is all this going to be done to help ensure that it's done peacefully?
Yeah, I think the first step is what seems to be happening right now, which is kind of dialing back that rhetoric of force and taking, and even in the clip that you aired with the president saying, we invite Greenlanders to have their referendum or to make decisions about their sovereignty. I think respecting the sovereignty of the people living there is really important, and also respecting that relationship that exists vis-a-vis Greenland and Denmark, and really working together with our allies, as Lana mentioned, to ensure that that peaceful diplomacy is the key to I think everybody winning. I mean, it doesn't have to be a take and give kind of situation. I think there's a way for everyone's security to be protected, for development of perhaps more greater U.S. presence in Greenland, which Denmark seems to be very open to, and working with our allies to ensure that this alliance that has served us so well stay strong.
We have just a few minutes left in the program, and as folks who are in the classroom, I'm curious, teaching moments here. What are you both finding, and I'll give you each about a minute, what are you finding in the classroom to be the greatest way to maybe get this to the students, and what are they asking, Jody?
Sure, I think students are curious about this. I mean, they're not familiar with this kind of discussion and rhetoric, and so they have a lot of questions about, just where Greenland is. First of all, what, who lives there, the kinds of things that we've been talking about here today, I think, have been all questions. And then, are we still secure? Is there a threat to, our security? And also, are there benefits that we're not realizing economically? I think is a question, and sort of how do we move forward in a changing world to ensure that prosperity and security are maintained.
Okay, Lana, about a minute.
I teach international law, so I get a lot of questions regarding sovereignty and going back to the UN Charter, what makes a state a state. And so in that kind of context, the question is, can you buy a territory? Can you buy somebody else's territory? I also teach foreign and national security policy, and so that is a completely different set of questions regarding what are some of our priorities. What are priorities of the United States in this part of the world, and what should they be if we want to make sure that we are protected and that we're not allowing adversaries to come a little too close to our coastlines. Okay. So there's a lot of there to unpack.
I would say so. Talking with Lana Obradovic and Jody Neathery-Castro today about why Greenland. We're going to put up a graphic for our viewers in case folks are wanting more information about Greenland. I found this website pretty interesting. Visit Greenland.com. Ladies, I want to thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise. Final thoughts, Jody, in just a few seconds here.
I think it's super interesting. I'm glad to see the Arctic getting more attention, even if it's sometimes a little bit dicey in terms of what the future might be, but excited to see what's next, and our students are too.
Okay, thanks, Lana.
I think as long as we reaffirm respect for Greenland's sovereignty and for Danish rule right now, but also engage very directly with NATO on some kind of international agreement on how do we proceed, and double down on diplomacy.
Okay.
There's no better way.
Thank you both so much for being here. To our students who are working so hard behind the scenes, and of course, to all of you for watching. We will see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television in the School of Communication. More information and program archives can be found at nebraskapublicmedia.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call the UNO School of Communication at 402-554-2600 during regular business hours. Or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.